The agent looked at me like she had just seen a ghost, and in that moment I felt something inside me start to slip, like the ground under my feet was beginning to tilt, and I had no idea why. Her hand froze over the keyboard, and she whispered that something was wrong with my social security number. And for a split second I wondered if this was some kind of clerical mistake or if my whole life had been built on something I never understood. I remember thinking one question that hit me harder than anything had in years. If my ID was not mine, then who the hell was I? I had walked into the state insurance office that morning with nothing more than a sore shoulder and a stack of papers in a folder I had used for years. The air in the building smelled like old carpet and stale coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that low hum that always made me feel like I needed to get out as fast as possible. I had barely slept the night before, and the pain in my shoulder was climbing again in the familiar slow burn. I needed this coverage. I needed some kind of break for once. I sat down at the counter while the agent clicked through her computer screen. Her name tag said, Carla. She had kind eyes and a tired look, like she had been doing this job for too long. She asked for my forms, and I slid them to her. Then she asked for my social security number, and I recited it the same way I had recited it since I was old enough to fill out a tax form. She typed it in. Her expression changed. At first it was confusion. Then it sharpened into something that made the hair on my arms rise. She typed it again, slower. Her breath caught. She leaned back from the screen, and her eyes moved over me like she was trying to match my face to something she did not want to believe. I asked her what was going on, but she did not answer right away. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and she swallowed hard. She told me her system was flagging my number, and she needed to verify something. Her voice had lost that easy, polite tone from earlier. Now it sounded careful, almost frightened. I felt my pulse start to thud in my neck. I told her the number was correct. I told her I had used it for my job at Rocky Vale Lumber for years. I told her it was on every paycheck. She nodded, but she was not convinced. She tried to smile in a way that looked forced. Then she reached for the phone. She dialed without looking at it and spoke quietly to someone on the other end. I heard words like urgent and verification, and yes, he is standing right here. She hung up and asked me to stay seated. She avoided my eyes, like she was afraid of what she might see if she looked too directly. I sat there trying to make sense of what was happening. My palms were starting to sweat, and the chair under me felt smaller by the second. People walked in and out of the office behind me, completely unaware that my world had begun to unravel in the span of a few breaths. A few minutes later, a mutt walked toward us from the back office. He wore a plain suit and carried himself like someone who had just been pulled out of a meeting he did not want interrupted. He introduced himself as Victor from the verification team, but his voice barely registered. He asked Carla to show him the screen. She turned it toward him. He stared at it for the long moment. Then he stared at me. He looked at me like he was comparing my face to something he had memorized a long time ago. Something about the way he studied me made the room seem smaller. He asked me to confirm my name, my date of birth, the town where I grew up. I answered everything without hesitation. These were things I had been sure of my whole life. He did not nod. He did not react at all. He just kept looking between me and the screen. Then he asked if I had ever changed my name. I told him no. He asked if anyone in my family had ever talked about legal adoption. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I told him my mother had always said I was adopted, but she never gave any details. She always shut down the moment I asked more. My stepfather used to say things that made me feel unwanted, but I never thought any of it meant something like this. Victor rubbed the back of his neck like he was preparing to say something he wished he could avoid. He asked if I had any documentation from early childhood. I told him I did not, except for a birth certificate that looked old and photocopied. It was the only one I ever had. It never crossed my mind that it could be fake. He took a slow breath and told me there was a conflict with my number. I asked him what conflict. He hesitated and asked Carla to print something. She clicked a few keys and a sheet of paper slid out of the printer. She handed it to him with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked at the page, then back at me, then at the page again. He said my number matched an infant recorded as abducted from a hospital in Lincoln 25 years ago. He said the number belonged to a child reported missing before he was even old enough to walk. He said the file was part of an old federal record that had never been cleared because no body was ever found. Everything inside me went still. It felt like the air thickened around me. I told him there had to be a mistake. I told him I had grown up in Kansas with my mother and stepfather. I told him I had gone to school, had jobs, had a life. He listened, but his expression told me none of that mattered against what was on that paper. He told Carla to call security. She did not question him. She picked up the phone again, and her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. I felt my throat go dry. I stood up without thinking, and Victor raised a hand in a calm but firm gesture. He told me not to leave. He said he understood this was a shock, but I needed to stay where I was until the verification team completed the process. I asked him again if he was sure. He said the type of flag on my number did not trigger by accident. Then he asked me if my mother had ever explained the circumstances of my adoption. I said she never gave details. The closest she ever came was telling me I had been left outside a clinic and she had stepped in to take me home because no one else would. The story had always sounded strange, but she said it with such conviction that I believed it. She was the only parent I had for most of my childhood. My stepfather, Leonard, never treated me like I belonged. He always made sure I knew I was not his responsibility. He used to say things that cut deep even when I was too young to understand why they hurt so much. Victor asked for my mother's current address. I told him I had not spoken to her in years. Leonard and I had a blowout when I was 19, and I left home for good. I had no idea where they moved after that. I had built my life on keeping distance from them because being close never felt safe. Security arrived at the counter. 2 officers in simple uniforms. They did not put their hands on me or treat me like a threat. They just stood nearby, watching. Victor pulled out his phone and stepped aside, speaking softly into it. I stared at the desk in front of me, trying to process everything. Carla placed a bottle of water near my hand. I did not drink it. I could barely feel my fingers. Victor returned after a minute. He said a federal agent was on the way and wanted to speak with me directly. I felt my stomach sink like a stone. I asked him if I was in trouble. He said that was not the issue. He said the priority was identification. He said that for all I knew, my entire life had been built on a name that never belonged to me. That was the moment something inside me cracked in a way I could not hide. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself and tried to breathe through the panic rising in my chest. Outside the window, cars kept rolling through the parking lot, and people walked in and out, living ordinary lives while mine felt like it was splitting down the middle. Victor asked if I had anyone I could call, a friend or partner, someone who could meet me. I shook my head. My closest friend moved out of state last year, and the woman I had been seeing left months ago because I could never open up to her the way she wanted. The agent had not arrived yet, and the room felt too quiet. I felt more exposed than I ever had in my life. I leaned against the counter, breathing slowly, trying to hold on to something solid inside me. I did not know it then, but everything that came next would change the course of my life in ways I could not begin to imagine. I walked out of that office feeling like someone had reached inside my chest and pulled out the one thing that made my life make sense. then dropped it on the floor and told me it did not belong to me. Outside, the parking lot looked exactly the same as when I went in. Same cracked asphalt, same dented cars, same faded lines. Nothing out there had changed, but everything in my head had. I got into my truck and just sat there for a minute with my hands on the wheel, heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my teeth. The agent, Victor, had told me a federal investigator would be in touch. He had said the word abducted like it was just another line item on a form. Abducted from a hospital 25 years ago. My number attached to some kid who vanished before he could tie his own shoes. None of it felt real. It felt like one of those stories you see on the news that you shake your head at, then forget by the next commercial break. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and the low drone of other cars. I could not stop thinking about my mother and the story she had told me my entire life. She always said I was adopted, not in a loving, this is a special thing way. More like a reminder, like a label stamped on my forehead. When I was little, if I asked why I did not look like her, she would say that God had left me on the doorstep of a clinic in Wichita and that she had been the only one kind enough to bring me home. I grew up believing that. I pictured myself in some cardboard box next to a metal door, freezing and crying until she swept me up. As a kid, that image almost made her a hero in my mind. As I got older, it started to feel different, sharper, like she was less a rescuer and more someone who wanted credit for something she never fully wanted. My stepfather, Leonard, never let me forget I was not his. He had come into the picture when I was around 6, with a pack of cigarettes in his shirt pocket and a permanent scowl under his mustache. He owned a small roofing company for a while, then bounced between odd jobs when that folded. He liked to drink at night and complain about his back, and about everything else on this earth. He did not hit me. He did not have to. He knew that words could do the job just fine. When bills were tight, he would call me that extra mouth. If I broke something by accident, he would ask why Marilyn had bothered to drag some other woman's mistake into our house. When he was really mad, he would say I should be grateful anybody took me in at all. Given where I came from, I never knew where that was supposed to be. Every time I asked, my mother would go quiet. She would say I did not need to dwell on the past, that the past was ugly and she had saved me from it. Then she would walk out of the room and busy herself with dishes or laundry until my questions dried up. We moved from Kansas to a small town outside Lincoln when I was 8. The story was that Leonard had gotten a better job up north. I did not remember much about the move itself, just a vague impression of boxes and long drives, and one night in a cheap motel where the carpet smelled like mildew. I do remember my mother being more tense than usual, checking the rear-view mirror over and over as if someone might be following us. Leonard told her to relax and called her paranoid. She did not answer him. The house in Nebraska was the one that stayed in my memory the clearest. One level, old siding, a yard that was almost always either too muddy or too dry. There was a spare room at the end of the hall that was always kept locked. My mother said it was storage. Leonard said nothing at all. That door was just a fact of life, like the crack in the living room ceiling or the drip in the bathroom sink. As a little kid, I tried the knob a few times when no one was looking. It never turned. Eventually, I stopped. In a house where I already felt like a guest. I learned fast not to push my luck. When I turned 12, my personal space shrank even more. Leonard started drafting me into his projects. Roofing repairs, hauling shingles, scraping paint. He called it teaching me responsibility. It felt more like free labor. He would stand there with a beer in his hand and watch me climb ladders with arms that shook from exhaustion. If I slowed down, he would remind me that I owed him. that regular fathers did not have to take care of kids that were not theirs. My mother would watch from the kitchen window sometimes, her fingers gripping the edge of the sink so tight the skin around her knuckles went white. She rarely said anything. When she did, it was always later, when he was not around. She would knock softly on my door at night and leave a plate of food or a folded t-shirt on the dresser. She would say that she was proud of me, that I was a good boy. Then she would slip out before I could ask her why she let him talk about me the way he did. Looking back, there were other things that did not make sense that I brushed off at the time. When I started school in Nebraska, the nurse asked for my vaccination records and birth certificate. My mother handed over a folder that had exactly the right documents. But some of them looked like copies of copies. The print was faint. The dates were just barely clear enough to read. When the nurse pointed this out, my mother laughed in that brittle way she did when she was nervous and said Kansas must have cheap printers. In 8th grade, we had to bring in baby pictures for some yearbook project. I asked my mother where mine were. She stood in front of the hall closet, staring at the shelves, as if she had suddenly forgotten how they were organized. Then she said all the old photo albums had gotten ruined in a flood before we moved. She told me to use my 1st grade picture instead. I remember sitting in that classroom, surrounded by kids laughing over photos of themselves as chubby toddlers, while I handed over a stiff school portrait of a boy who already looked like he knew better than to expect much. There was one afternoon that keeps coming back to me now. I was 14, sitting in my room pretending to study while really just trying to be invisible. The smell of smoke drifted through the open window. I went outside and saw my mother in the backyard, hunched over a metal trash barrel, feeding papers into the flames. Her shoulders shook as she worked. Leonard was at his job, so it was just her. I asked her what she was burning. For a second, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then she said it was just old bills. I did not believe her, not completely, but I did not push. She had that wild look in her eyes I had only seen a few times, like something inside her was close to snapping. I was not the only one who noticed. Our neighbor, Mrs. Jacobs, a nosy woman with a sharp tongue but a strangely kind heart, was hanging laundry on her line. She watched my mother and shook her head. Later that week, when I was helping her carry in grocery bags, she asked quietly if everything was all right at home. She said my mother seemed on edge. I told her we were fine. What else was I supposed to say? All of those moments sat somewhere in the back of my mind. Disconnected fragments that never formed a clear picture. Now, driving back to my apartment after what happened at the insurance office, those fragments started pressing against each other in ways that made my skin crawl. I pulled into the lot of my building and cut the engine. The place looked as tired as I felt. Faded siding, crooked railings, the usual junk piled near the dumpsters. I climbed the stairs to my unit and unlocked the door. Inside, it was the same small space it had always been. A worn couch, a cheap table with one good chair, a kitchen that never seemed to lose the faint smell of fried food, no matter how much I scrubbed. I closed the door and leaned my back against it, letting the silence settle around me. I went to the drawer where I kept my important papers. It was not a big drawer. Tax returns, a dog-eared copy of my birth certificate, the Social Security card I had carried since my first real job. I spread them out on the table and tried to look at them the way Victor must have looked at that screen. Not as parts of my life, but as evidence. The birth certificate said I was born in a clinic outside Wichita. The seal looked official enough. The signature at the bottom was from a doctor I had never met. The date matched what I had always celebrated as my birthday. Still, something about the way the ink sat on the page felt off, like it had been printed long after the fact. I thought about the idea of a kid taken from a hospital, a baby lifted out of a car seat when his mother turned her back for a second. I pictured my own mother, or the woman I had always called my mother, walking out of a building with a child that did not belong to her, telling herself whatever story she needed to hear to live with it. My phone buzzed on the table, making me jump. For a second, I thought it might be the federal agent already. It was just a notification from the power company. Past due. Pay now. I ignored it. I sat down and rubbed my hands over my face. Memories kept flashing through my head. The way my mother flinched when I asked about my first few years. The panic in her eyes when social workers came by the school to check addresses. The locked room at the end of the hall. The barrel fire in the backyard. For years I had told myself she was just a private person with a rough past. A woman who had made some bad choices and did not want to talk about it. Now another possibility was starting to form in the back of my mind. One that made my chest feel tight and my stomach roll. I pushed back from the table and paced the length of the apartment. There was not much space to cover, but I walked it over and over, trying to burn off the restless energy crawling under my skin. I kept hearing Leonard's voice in my head, telling me I should be grateful, that no one else would have wanted me. The words felt different now, less like cruelty and more like a hint I had not been smart enough to follow. Eventually, I stopped pacing and sat back down. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stared at my birth certificate one more time and realized I needed answers that no piece of paper in that drawer could give me. Somewhere between the place where I started and the man I had become, the truth about who I really was had been buried. And whether I liked it or not, it was about to be dug up. By the time I got back to my apartment, the light outside the blinds had turned that flat gray color that makes everything feel colder than it really is. I dropped my wallet on the counter and just stood there in the tiny kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the pipes knock in the wall like the building was having a panic attack for me. My phone was still in my hand. I kept staring at the screen, half expecting it to flash some message from the government saying, "Never mind. Big mistake. Just a glitch in the system." Instead, it was nothing. No calls from Linda, no calls from Raymond. Just a notification about my past due internet bill. I sank down into the chair at the little two-person table and pressed my thumb into the bruised spot along my shoulder where the forklift had slammed me into the steel rack. Pain shot down my arm, and that at least felt real. Everything else from that office felt like I had imagined it. According to that system, you are dead. The words kept looping in my head. Dead in Kansas in 2011. I had never even been to Kansas, at least as far as I knew. The phone buzzed in my hand, and I almost dropped it. Unknown number. Out of habit, I almost let it go to voicemail. But something inside me whispered that letting this one ring out would be a mistake. I hit accept and lifted it to my ear. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, female, probably somewhere in her 40s. She introduced herself as Laura McKinney from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She said my social security number had been flagged in connection with an old case and that my file had just been sent to her office. I sat up a little straighter. My kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. She asked me to confirm my name. Marcus Hale. My date of birth. March 10th, 1990. Where I grew up. Lincoln, Nebraska. As far as I knew, anyway. She was quiet for a moment, like she was lining things up in her head. Then she said there was a file from 2010 about a child named Mason Warren, who disappeared from a hospital parking lot in Topeka. Kansas, 2 years old. Last seen buckled into a car seat while his mother loaded groceries into the trunk. A woman distracted her, asked for directions. When she turned back, the car seat was empty. I could hear the faint echo of an office behind her. Printers, phones, distant voices. It all sounded a long way from my kitchen, but her words landed right in the middle of my chest. I told her I had never been to Kansas, never heard of the Warrens, never heard that name Mason in my life. She did not argue. She just said that sometimes in these cases, children were relocated, moved across state lines, given new identities, told new stories. That sometimes the records only made sense when you looked at them side by side. She asked if I remembered ever moving as a kid. I said Linda used to talk about Kansas like a place we had escaped from. She never said exactly when. She used to say we left because of bad memories, that my real mother had left me there and that she had rescued me. Saying it out loud made it sound more insane than it ever had in my head. Laura asked about early memories. Before grade school, before the little house in Lincoln. I tried to reach back, and everything before about age 5 felt like fog with a few shapes floating in it. The smell of antiseptic. A room that echoed. A woman crying, but I could not see her face. Just her hands clutching at a blanket. I told her that, and my voice shook more than I wanted it to. She said memory around trauma can be like that. Fragmented, unreliable, full of holes where your brain hid the sharp parts. Then, she got practical. She said, in that same calm voice, that the Social Security Administration had flagged my number after the county office ran it. That her office had been alerted because of the missing child case, and that the next step was a DNA test. She asked if I would be willing to come to the federal building in Omaha for a swab. My first instinct was to say no, to hang up, drive to Linda's house, throw the whole thing in her face, demand answers on my own terms. But the image of that red alert on Karen's screen flashed behind my eyes. According to this, you died in 2011. I heard myself say yes. I could come. She gave me an address downtown and a time the next morning. She told me to bring whatever documents I had. Birth certificate, Social Security card, anything from before high school if it existed. There was a softness in her tone when she added that last part, like she already guessed it did not. When the call ended, the apartment felt even quieter than before. I set the phone down on the table like it might explode. A minute later, it buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a number I knew, but had not seen in more than a year. It was Ariana, my ex. We had been together for 3 years, off and on. She was the kind of woman who kept color-coded spreadsheets for fun. Numbers and patterns were her entire life. We had ended things when she moved to Denver, and I refused to leave Lincoln. That was the story I told myself anyway. Her message was short. She said she had heard from a friend at the county office that my paperwork had caused some kind of problem. She said she was not trying to pry, but she owed me honesty about something she had never said before. Back when we had filed joint returns, there had been weirdness with my records. Notices that said my number belonged to someone marked as deceased. She had called the hotline. They told her it was probably a clerical error and she had let it go. But she had always wondered if there was more to it. Reading that made my stomach twist. It meant this had not started today. This had been sitting in the system for years, blinking red while I went about my life, thinking everything was fine. I typed back that I was dealing with it, that I would be fine. I did not tell her about Mason or Kansas or the word missing echoing through my head. I did not really know how. I put the phone down again and stared at the wood grain of the table until the lines blurred. My shoulder throbbed. Somewhere upstairs, someone started a vacuum and then turned it off again. Another memory surfaced, one I had not thought about in years. My coworker Daniel Mercer leaning on a pallet jack at the warehouse 2 years ago, telling me he got a weird error when payroll ran my info through a new system. Some comment about my number being tagged in an audit. I had laughed it off. Told him the government could not keep track of anything. He had shrugged, said as long as the check cleared, it was not his business. I wished I had taken it more seriously. The phone buzzed a third time. This one was from right across the hall. Harper Quinn lived in 2B. She was 20-something, art student, part-time barista, always leaving her bike leaned against the stair rail. We traded hellos on the way, in and out. She knew I worked nights until my shoulder took me out of the game. Her message said she did not want to be weird. But she had seen squad cars outside my mom's house on the edge of town when she drove past an hour ago. She had recognized Linda's old blue sedan in the driveway and a county cruiser parked behind it. She asked if everything was okay. I read that twice. My pulse picked up. I called her instead of texting back. She answered on the first ring, said she had gone to the grocery store near that neighborhood and had taken a shortcut past our old street. She saw an unmarked car and a cruiser out front. She also said something that made my mouth go dry. A few weeks ago, she had dropped by Linda's with some extra cupcakes from work. And through the back gate, she had seen Linda burning what looked like a shoebox of papers in a metal barrel. When Linda noticed her, she had slammed the lid on the barrel and waved like nothing was wrong. At the time, Harper had thought it was just trash. Now she was not so sure. I thanked her, told her I appreciated her telling me, promised I would let her know if I needed anything. When I hung up, my hand was shaking. So the government thought I was dead. A missing child case in Kansas had my number on it. My ex had seen weird death flags on my file. My coworker had, too. And now cops were at Linda's house while she burned boxes of paper in the backyard. There is a point where coincidence stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a trap closing. I stood up, grabbed my wallet again, then went to the drawer where I kept my important documents. It was a thin drawer. Birth certificate, social security card, a folded photocopy of an immunization record that started when I was already school age. Nothing about a hospital, nothing about Kansas. The birth certificate looked official enough, except the paper felt newer than it should have for a document from 1990. I held it up to the light, looking for something. I did not know what. Some sign that it was fake. It just looked like paper. My phone buzzed on the table. A new notification, this time from an unknown email that had been forwarded to me by the caseworker at the county office. It was a formal notice that my benefits application had been placed on hold pending federal review. There was also a line near the bottom that said my social security number matched an open investigation and that I should expect contact from federal authorities. Too late for that, I thought. I set the birth certificate down and leaned both hands on the table, letting the weight of my body press through my shoulders. The cheap wood creaked. I stared at the sink, the cracked tile backsplash, the faded paint where someone had covered an old water stain. This had been my whole world for so long. A couple of rooms, a job that paid enough to keep the lights on. A mother who said I should be grateful she had taken me in when no one else wanted me. Now all of that looked like a set someone had built around a lie. On the counter, my phone buzzed one more time. A text from Laura McKinney. She said if transportation was an issue, they could arrange a ride to Omaha. She said cases like this did not always end with a reunion, but they always ended with answers. I picked up the phone, stared at that sentence for a long time. Answers? I did not know if I was ready for them. I did not know if anyone ever really was, but I knew I was done living with the questions. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, slid my documents into an envelope, and started planning the drive to Omaha in my head, mile by mile, as if putting the route together could keep my thoughts from flying apart. The highway out of Lincoln was quiet in the early morning, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound in the car feel louder than it should. The wipers dragged across the windshield in a slow rhythm as I drove toward Omaha with the envelope of documents on the passenger seat. For most of the drive, my mind circled the same thoughts, the same questions. Every time my brain tried to settle on something solid, it slipped away like water through my fingers. By the time I pulled into the parking garage below the federal building, my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I found a spot on the second level, killed the engine, and just sat there breathing in and out until my chest loosened. Then I grabbed the envelope and headed inside. Security waved me through after checking my ID. The same ID that the government system insisted belonged to someone who died 13 years ago. That thought made my stomach twist again as I stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the 6th floor. The doors opened to a bright hallway lined with offices. A woman in a dark blazer stepped out to meet me. She asked if I was Marcus Hale. Her voice was steady and warm in a way that felt out of place in a place like this. She introduced herself as Laura McKinney from NSMEC and motioned for me to follow her. We walked into a conference room with blinds drawn against the morning sun. The table was clean except for a small plastic tube, a clipboard, and a laptop already pulled up to a case file. She asked if I had brought my documents. I handed her the envelope, and she spread everything out with careful hands, studying each item like it was a puzzle piece. She said the birth certificate looked printed on the right kind of paper, but she pointed out that the date the registrar signed, it was 8 months after the listed birth date. She said that did not always mean fraud, but it was unusual. She set the Social Security card next to it. The ink on the number looked newer than the rest of the card. She did not accuse me of anything. She kept her tone even, clinical, like she had done this 1,000 times. She asked if I remembered anything from before I was 5. I told her what I could: the fog, the crying, the smell of disinfectant, the feeling that I had lived behind glass for a while, before I lived in Lincoln. She nodded and made notes. Then she picked up the plastic tube and explained the DNA swab. I sat at the table as she scraped the inside of my cheek, sealed the sample, and placed it in a labeled bag. My full name, my date of birth, my case number, all written next to each other like they belonged in the same sentence. While the courier came to pick up the sample, she turned the laptop toward me. A picture filled the screen. A grainy shot from a security camera aimed at a hospital parking lot. A woman in a light jacket, carrying a small child pressed against her shoulder. The video quality made her face blurry, but her build, her dark hair pulled tight the way Linda used to wear it, the way she held the child close like she was shielding it. Something about it made my throat dry. She said this footage was from Topeka in 2010, the day Mason Warren went missing. I stared at the image and could feel a pressure building behind my eyes. My voice came out rough when I asked if she was saying Linda had taken me from that parking lot. She said they were not making accusations until they had the DNA results, but the timeline matched. Linda had lived in Kansas from 2009 to 2012. She left suddenly 1 year after the disappearance. There was no record of any legal adoption, no hospital record of her giving birth around the time she came to Nebraska. She clicked to another file. This one, a summary from a social worker in Kansas who had visited Linda years ago. The notes mentioned a child named Grant, 3 years old, who had died in early 2011, a traffic accident. I stared at that line, feeling something cold settle in my gut. Laura told me that sometimes parents who lose a young child fall into a psychological state that makes them fixate on replacement. She said she had seen cases where grief twisted into something desperate, even dangerous. She paused to let the words settle. I told her Linda had always avoided talking about the past, that she kept a locked room in the house for as long as I could remember, that she had burned boxes in the yard. Saying it all out loud made the air in the room feel heavier, like the walls were leaning in. A knock at the door broke the silence. A man in a gray suit stepped in. He introduced himself as Agent Coleman from the Social Security Administration Fraud Division. He carried a folder and asked if he could speak openly in front of me. Laura nodded and stepped back. He opened the folder and laid out a sheet that showed every time my number had been queried in the system. A few routine checks from employers, a tax return, and then a cluster of checks from a computer in Kansas in 2011 and 2012. He said the IP address matched the home Linda lived in at the time. I stared at the red marks on the page and felt the room tilt slightly. Linda had checked that number right after Grant died. She had looked up the identity of a dead child and then put that identity on me. Agent Coleman said this was not proof of anything yet, but the patterns were consistent with identity reassignment in a child abduction case. He said the system had not caught it earlier because the records were messy back then, and because Linda had moved states. He closed the folder and gave me a sympathetic look before leaving. Laura waited until the door closed, then asked if I was okay. I shook my head even though I tried to say yes. It came out as a rasp that fooled no one. She said people in situations like mine often felt like the ground had been pulled out from under them. She told me that whatever the test showed, they would walk me through every step and that this would not define me. I appreciated the words, even though I barely heard them. She asked if I wanted to see the rest of the file. I hesitated, then nodded. She opened a page with 2 photographs side by side. A baby with bright eyes in a blue beanie. A toddler in a red jacket smiling at something off camera. Mason Warren at 18 months and at 2 years old. My breath caught. I did not recognize him, but something about the shape of his nose, the slope of his chin. It was like looking at a distant relative you had only heard about in stories. Laura told me his parents were still alive. They lived in Colorado. They had never stopped looking. She said it quietly, like she did not want to overwhelm me. I felt my chest tighten. For a second, I imagined what they looked like now. How their home might still have a room filled with toys frozen in time. How every missing person's anniversary must have carved another layer into their lives. Laura said she would call me as soon as the test results came back. Probably within 48 hours. She asked if I needed a ride. I said I would drive myself. She gave me a card anyway, just in case. When I stepped out of the building, the sun hit me straight in the eyes. I stood on the sidewalk with the traffic rushing past and felt like the world had tilted just enough to make me lose my balance. I tried to breathe slow. One breath, then another. I walked to the parking garage without really seeing anything around me. My footsteps echoed on the concrete. When I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, my hands were trembling again. The envelope with my documents sat on the passenger chair, thinner than ever. I looked at it, then at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I did not recognize the man staring back as fully as I had the day before. I turned the key in the ignition and let the engine idle. I needed to drive back to Lincoln. I needed to figure out how to face the one person who could answer everything, and the person I least trusted to tell me the truth. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the garage into the late morning light, trying to steady my breathing as the road stretched out ahead of me. I drove south out of Omaha with the radio off, letting the sound of the tires fill the silence. The morning glare softened as the miles went by, but the weight in my chest stayed the same. By the time I crossed into Lancaster County, my jaw ached from keeping it clenched. The closer I got to Linda's house, the more every memory of that place pushed up like bruises I had forgotten were there. I pulled onto the old street near the edge of Lincoln, where the houses sat low and close together, each one with the same sag in the roof from too many winters. Linda's place was at the end of the block, a white one-story with peeling trim and a lawn that never quite recovered from the drought 5 summers ago. There was no cruiser in front now, no unmarked car. Just her blue sedan under the carport and the curtains drawn tight like always. I parked across the street and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. My heart felt like it wanted to climb up my throat. I took a breath that didn't help, then another, then stepped out of the car. Detective Rosa Hill stood near the gate, talking quietly with another officer who was loading something into the back of a van. Hill noticed me and walked over. She was in plain clothes, dark jacket, hair pulled back tight. Her face was calm, but there was a seriousness in her eyes that made my stomach twist. She asked if I was all right. I said no, but I was here. She nodded like that was the only answer she expected. She said they had spoken with Linda earlier that morning. Said Linda avoided questions, then broke down, then refused to continue without a lawyer. Hill stepped aside and asked if I was ready to come in. There was no right answer, so I just walked past her. The smell inside the house hit me first. A mix of cleaning spray, old carpet, and something stale, like air that had been shut inside too long. It felt smaller than I remembered, darker too. Every picture frame on the walls showed Linda smiling at me over the years, but looking at them now made my stomach roll. The smiles were tight, forced, like she was posing with someone she could not risk letting go. Hill guided me toward the hallway. At the end was a door I had never been allowed to open. Linda always said it was storage. She had kept a small padlock on it since I was a kid. I used to imagine old holiday decorations inside, or donated clothes, or boxes of bills she never threw away, anything normal, anything but what it really was. The padlock lay on the floor, cut clean through. Hill motioned for me to go ahead if I felt able. My hand shook when I reached for the knob, but I turned it anyway. The room was dim, a single lamp on the dresser, casting a weak glow over the walls. What I saw made my knees go weak. My breath caught halfway out of my chest. On the bed was a cardboard box full of baby things. Small shirts, a knitted hat, a faded blanket with cartoon bears printed on it. Underneath that was a stack of papers. Hospital documents, an immunization record from St. Mary's Hospital in Kansas with the name Mason Warren printed at the top. There were police flyers too, folded and creased. Missing child notices with the same toddler face printed over and over. I felt my throat close around something sharp. My hands went numb. I picked up one of the flyers, and the picture on it looked like the ones Laura had shown me. Except this one was clearer. Mason smiling at something off camera. The date on the bottom from 2010. I knew then that the ground under me had never been real. Behind me, Hill gave me space, but I could feel her watching to make sure I did not collapse. I sat on the edge of the bed, the flyer shaking in my hand. I remembered Linda bringing me to this house when I was barely old enough to understand anything. I remembered her saying she saved me, that she pulled me out of a place where no one wanted me. I remembered believing her. The door behind me creaked and I turned. Linda stood there between the officers. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Shoulders slumped, eyes wet and wide. She asked if she could talk to me. Hill looked at me, waiting for my cue. I nodded once. Linda stepped forward. Her voice cracked before she even got the first word out. She said she was sorry. She said she never meant for any of this to happen. She said after her real son, Grant, died in that wreck, she had been broken in a way she could not describe. She had gone to the hospital that day, looking for a sign that life was not finished with her. Then she saw a woman loading groceries with a child in the car seat. She said she did not plan it. She said she acted because something inside her snapped. Hearing her talk about it like it was an accident made the heat rise in my chest. I told her that what she did destroyed lives, I told her that whatever she thought she was saving me from, she stole everything I was before I even knew who I was supposed to be. She covered her mouth with her hands and started shaking. She said she loved me. She said she had always loved me. She said she was afraid that if she admitted the truth, she would lose me too. I heard the words, but they felt like static. Love was not supposed to feel like a locked room and a forged birth certificate. Raymond stepped into the hallway behind her. His face was pale, eyes darting between me and the officers. He said he only found out years later. He said he wanted to go to the police, but she threatened to walk into traffic if he did. He said he thought keeping the secret was better than pushing her over the edge. I stared at him and felt nothing but emptiness. All those nights he lectured me about responsibility, all the hours he worked me in the yard, all the times he said I should be thankful. He knew, and he let it happen anyway. Hill stepped in and signaled the officers. She said the time for statements was over. They placed Linda in cuffs. Linda begged to say one more thing, but they guided her toward the front door. She kept her eyes on me and kept saying sorry, 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 until her voice faded into the hallway. They cuffed Raymond next. He did not resist. He looked at me and said he hoped one day I would understand. I told him that understanding was not something he had earned. When the house finally quieted, Hill asked if I wanted a moment alone. I nodded. She stepped out and pulled the door mostly shut. I sat in that locked room, surrounded by the pieces of a life I never lived. My hands drifted across the little clothes folded in the box. Each one still smelled faintly of old fabric softener. I tried to imagine myself small enough to wear them. I tried to imagine the woman from Colorado holding me at that age. I tried to imagine what would make a person take a child and pretend he belonged to her. I stood up and walked around the room slowly. On the dresser was a picture frame face down. I lifted it. Inside was a photo of Grant, Linda's real son, a little boy with the same wide eyes she always insisted I had as a toddler. The one she said proved I was meant to be hers. I held that photo for a long time, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. Then I set it down and walked out of the room. Hill waited for me in the living room. She told me the legal process would move quickly. She told me the federal office would contact me once the DNA results were confirmed. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I said I did, even though I was not sure that was true. Before I left, I looked once more down the hallway toward the open door of the room that had been locked my entire life. It felt smaller now, emptied of its power. The secrets that lived there were no longer secrets. I stepped outside into the sunlight and breathed the cold air. The officers were loading Linda and Raymond into separate cars. Linda turned her head toward me before the door closed. Her face was streaked with tears. I felt nothing. The engine of my car rumbled as I started it. My hands trembled on the wheel again. A part of me wanted to peel away from that house and never look back. Another part knew that no matter how far I drove, the truth I had uncovered would follow me. I pulled away from the curb and let the house shrink in the mirror. For the first time in my life, I understood that the place I thought was home had never been home at all. I kept driving until the street curved out of sight. The road out of Lincoln stretched ahead like a long, quiet ribbon. The kind you can follow for miles without thinking about anything except the way the horizon never seems to get any closer. I drove without music, without even touching the vents, letting the air inside the car go stale while the world outside passed in a blur. I did not know what part of Colorado I was heading toward, except the town name the investigators had given me. I punched it into my phone and followed the route like a man, following instructions on how to walk after years of limping. Hours passed before the mountain started rising out of the distance. Colorado looked different from Nebraska in a way that made my chest tighten. The shapes of the land felt sharper, more permanent, like they belonged to people who knew where they came from. I wondered if I had ever belonged anywhere at all. I pulled into the parking lot of a modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of Fort Collins. The driveway had a silver pickup parked beside a sedan with a faded bumper sticker. A front porch light hung over a wooden swing, the chain creaking gently in the breeze. For a moment I sat in the car gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. A woman appeared at the doorway. She froze when she saw me, one hand pressed against the frame as if she needed something steady to hold on to. Her hair was streaked with gray, pulled into a soft twist behind her head. She looked small but not fragile, the way someone looks after years of carrying a burden that never gets lighter. The front door opened wider, and a tall man stepped behind her. His jawline was rough, his shoulders broad, a mechanic by the look of his hands and the oil stains on his jeans. He placed a hand on her back, but his eyes never left me. I stepped out of the car slowly. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. My legs felt like I had borrowed them from someone taller. The woman whispered something I could not hear and took 2 steps onto the porch. Then a third, then a fourth. The closer she got, the more her face trembled. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she even reached the front walkway. She said my name. Not Marcus, Mason. The sound of it cut through me like a blade wrapped in cotton. I had heard the name a dozen times in the last few days. But coming from her voice, it felt heavy, like something that had been waiting years to land where it belonged. I stopped a few feet from her. She reached out as if afraid I might vanish. When her hands touched my face, I felt something inside me I did not have a name for. It was not recognition, but it was something close, something old, something almost familiar. She said she had dreamed of this moment every night since 2010. She said she prayed every morning that her baby was still alive. Her voice cracked when she said the word baby, as if the years between then and now had not changed the shape of that word in her mouth. The man came down the steps and stood beside her. He nodded once at me, not trusting himself to speak. His face was tight with emotion he was fighting to keep under control. He said he had imagined different outcomes for so long that now, looking at me standing there alive, his knees felt weak. I followed them inside. The house smelled like coffee and old pine furniture. The walls were crowded with photographs, family gatherings, birthdays, holidays. But one wall had a row of framed age progression images. They showed a toddler growing into a boy, then a teen, then a young man, all guesses, all wrong, all meant to keep hope alive. There was a moment where none of us spoke. It felt like the air was holding its breath. A man stepped out from the hallway, maybe 3 years older than me. Broad shoulders, dark hair, a face that looked like mine if you softened the edges. He froze mid-step when he saw me. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He introduced himself as Caleb. He said he had spent half his life putting up flyers, talking to reporters, calling police departments, fielding tips from strangers who swore they had seen me at gas stations or parks or malls. He said he had promised their parents that one day he would bring his little brother home. His jaw tightened when he said it, like the promise had been carved into him. He said he was glad I was alive. Then he turned away before the tears got the best of him. We sat in the living room. They asked if I remembered anything. I told them the truth. Fog. Sounds. A crying woman. A room that echoed. Nothing with edges, nothing with names. Their faces fell, but they did not blame me. The mother, Jenna, brought out a small box. She set it on the coffee table and lifted the lid with careful hands. Inside were things that should have meant something to me. A toy car with chipped paint, baby shoes, a photo of me as a toddler wearing a red jacket, the same photo from the missing posters. She showed me pictures of birthdays I never had and vacations I never went on. She showed me a blanket that I had been wrapped in the day I was born. I held it in my hands and tried to feel something. Anything. But all I felt was a sadness so big, it took up the entire room. Michael, my father, asked if I was hungry. I said I did not know. He went into the kitchen anyway and started cooking something simple. Eggs and toast. Like he needed to do something with his hands to keep from drowning in the moment. Caleb sat across from me. His eyes were red but focused. He asked why I had come here alone. I told him I did not know how to show up any other way. He leaned forward and said he had spent 14 years wanting this moment. But now that it was here, he did not know what to feel. He said part of him wanted to hug me, and part of him wanted to scream at the world for stealing all those years from us. He said he knew none of it was my fault. But the feelings were messy, and he was trying to sort them in real time. I nodded and told him I understood more than he might think. He did not answer right away. Then he stood, walked to the hallway, and returned with another framed photo. It was the last family picture they took before I disappeared. Jenna holding me, Michael with his arm around her, Caleb grinning, missing a front tooth. He placed the photo in my hands and said that this was the last time they had all been together. He said every empty holiday after that had been a reminder of what had been taken. The weight of that photo made my breath slow. I had never seen myself as a child smiling like that. Not with joy that looked real. Michael called us into the kitchen. He had made 4 plates. Even though none of us were hungry, we gathered around the small table. No one knew what to say. The silence felt heavy, but not hostile. More like the quiet before something unfamiliar begins. After we ate a few bites, Jenna told me they had kept my room. She said it had been redone a few times to stay fresh, but it was always my room. She asked if I wanted to see it. I hesitated, but followed her down the hallway. She opened the door slowly. Inside, the walls were painted a soft blue. A small bed sat under the window. Shelves filled with books and toys lined the opposite wall. Everything was too small for the man I had become, but perfect for the child I had been. She told me she kept it exactly the way she thought I would have liked it if I had grown up here. She touched one of the shelves gently and said she tried to make it a place I would want to come home to if I ever found my way back. I stood in the middle of that room, feeling the weight of the years pressing down. I wanted to say something, but all the words were stuck somewhere behind my ribs. The room began to blur as my vision swam. I had not cried since I was a kid, but the tears came anyway. Slow at first, then harder. Jenna stepped toward me like she was approaching a wounded animal. She rested her hand on my arm. I did not pull away. She said, "One day at a time." She said we did not have to rush anything. She said they were just grateful I was alive. I wiped my face and nodded. Behind us. Caleb leaned in the doorway. His voice was rough when he said he was glad I had come, even if everything felt impossible right now. I could barely speak, but I thanked them. I told them I needed some air, and stepped out onto the back porch. The cold hit my face, sharp and grounding. I sat on the steps and stared out at the yard, where a swing set stood rusting in the corner. Maybe it had been mine. Maybe it had been waiting for me all this time. The door opened behind me. Michael stepped out, hands in his pockets. He sat next to me without saying anything. After a long moment, he told me that, whatever came next, I did not have to figure it out alone. I nodded but kept my eyes on the yard. The wind shifted and carried the scent of pine and cold earth. I felt more tired than I had in years. But under the exhaustion, there was a strange feeling building. something like the faintest trace of belonging. Not enough to claim yet, but enough to stay seated on that porch beside the man who had waited 14 years to see his son again. I breathed in slowly and let the cold settle inside me as the house behind us creaked in the wind. The wind kept brushing against my face while I sat on that porch. And after a while, the cold sank deep enough that my hands started to stiffen. I stood up slowly and followed Michael back inside. The house felt warmer than before, like the walls themselves were trying to welcome me, even if my head had not caught up yet. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm I did not know how to settle into. Jenna fussed over me in quiet ways, offering food or blankets or photographs whenever the silence stretched too long. Michael kept finding chores to do in the garage and would ask if I wanted to keep him company. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I stayed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how a life could split in two without me knowing. It was Caleb who struggled the most. I could feel him watching me from the corner of his eye in every room. Not angry, just unsure. Every time I turned his way, he looked like he was debating whether to say something or swallow it. On the third morning, when I walked into the kitchen and found him drinking coffee alone, he finally spoke. He said he had waited so long for this that he thought he would know exactly how to act. He said he imagined us talking like brothers, laughing, catching up on everything we missed. He tapped his thumb on the edge of the mug and told me he knew it was not fair to expect that from me. But his head kept trying to paste 14 years of hope onto a single moment. I sat at the table across from him and told him he did not owe me anything, and I did not owe him anything either. At least not yet. I said we were strangers who shared blood, and maybe one day we would share more. But there was no rule that said it had to happen overnight. He nodded, looking relieved in some ways and disappointed in others. Later that afternoon, Detective Hill called with an update. The state had officially charged Linda with kidnapping, identity fraud, and falsifying government records. The prosecutors planned to bring the case to court as soon as possible. Raymond had been charged as well for aiding in concealment. Hill asked if I was willing to provide a formal statement. I told her I would. She also said they had recovered more evidence from the house, including a burned hard drive that the tech unit was trying to extract data from. She mentioned finding printed pages from online forums where Linda had asked about changing a child's identity. Hearing it all laid out piece by piece made the back of my neck prickle. After the call ended, I stepped into the yard to clear my head. Jenna followed me out and placed a hand on my arm. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was somewhere between angry and numb. She said that was normal. She said grief comes in strange shapes when it arrives late. That evening, while we were setting the table for dinner, my phone buzzed. It was a video call from a number I did not recognize. Out of Lincoln. I hesitated before answering. Ariana's face appeared on the screen. The background behind her was the small Denver apartment she had moved into the year before. She said she had heard through a friend what had happened to me. She said she was sorry for every moment she had doubted me or thought I was hiding something out of shame. She said she had not known how deep it went. I did not know how to respond, except to say I was still trying to understand it myself. She asked if I wanted to talk sometime, maybe in person, just to catch up. I told her the truth. I said I appreciated her reaching out, but I had too much rebuilding to do to revisit anything from before. She nodded, smiled sadly, and told me she understood. When the call ended, I felt a strange lift in my chest, like closing a door that had been stuck half open for too long. After dinner, Caleb pulled me aside and asked if Linda had ever treated me like a replacement for her son. I told him I did not know what her intentions were because she rarely let emotions show, except when she wanted something. I told him she could be affectionate one moment and distant the next, like she was afraid touching me too much would break the illusion she built. He listened quietly, then said he wanted to show me something. He led me to his truck and drove us across town to a small storage facility. He unlocked a unit and flipped the light on. Inside were stacks of old flyers, newspaper clippings, and boxes labeled with my name, or the name they had hoped was still mine. For a moment I just stood there staring at all the physical proof of the years I missed. Caleb lifted one box down and opened it. Inside were binders full of every lead they had followed. Emails, police reports, notes from strangers who swore they had seen a kid who looked like me in a grocery store or a mall or a rest stop. Most leads went nowhere. A few had felt promising, then collapsed under scrutiny. Caleb said he had kept all of it because throwing anything out felt like giving up. His voice cracked, and he had to take a breath before he continued. He said he would have traded his whole life just to have grown up with me. All of it hit me harder than I thought it would. I had never imagined anyone wanting me that badly. He set the box back on the shelf. For the first time since we met, he stepped forward and pulled me into a rough, awkward hug. I stood still for a moment before lifting my arms and returning it. He let go quickly, embarrassed, but it was enough to shift something between us. The next morning, I drove with Michael to his shop. He said keeping busy helped when life felt too big to manage. The place smelled like engine oil and cold metal. He showed me the garage, the lift, the old Ford he was restoring with Caleb. I watched him work for a while, his hands steady, patient, the way a father works around a son he's trying not to overwhelm. We spent the rest of the morning tightening bolts and sorting tools. It was the closest thing to peace I had felt in weeks. At one point he looked over and said he used to imagine teaching me all this when I got older. He said sometimes imagination is the only rope a man has to hold on to when he is sinking. I told him I was sorry he lost so much time. He said he was just grateful he did not lose all of it. When we returned home, Jenna was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of official papers. She told me the DNA confirmation had come in. I was, without any doubt, their son. She pushed the folder toward me, my name printed at the top, the legal one I had just begun to reclaim. There was also a letter from the district attorney requesting my presence at the pre-trial hearing. My stomach tightened. I was not ready to see Linda again, not even across a courtroom, but I knew I would do it. As the evening settled in, Caleb and I sat on the back porch again. This time the silence felt less like distance and more like understanding. He asked if I planned to stay in Colorado for good. I told him I wanted to try. I said I had spent too many years feeling like a ghost in someone else's life, and maybe it was time to start living in my own. He nodded slowly. He said he would help however he could, even if it meant giving me space. Night settled over the yard, and the cold crept back into the air. Jenna called us inside, but I stayed out for another moment. I looked at the swing set in the corner of the yard, imagining the child I used to be and the life I was supposed to have lived. Then I turned towards the warm light coming from the kitchen window, the life I had a chance to rebuild, and stepped back inside. I stepped back inside, and the warmth wrapped around me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. For a long time I had walked into rooms and felt like an outsider passing through. Now, standing in that kitchen with the low hum of the oven and the faint sound of Jenna humming while she wiped the counter, something in me settled. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Over the next few weeks, the hearings moved quickly. The state wanted the case resolved without delay, and the evidence was more than enough. I drove back and forth between Colorado and Nebraska for the pre-trial meetings, each trip peeling back another layer of the life I had lived and the one I was walking into. Every time I stepped into the courthouse, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. But every time I stepped out, I felt a little lighter. The first hearing was the hardest. Linda sat at the defense table in a plain jumpsuit, her hair pulled back, her face thinner than I remembered. When she looked at me, I saw something desperate in her eyes. Not love, not regret. Something closer to fear, like she was afraid of disappearing completely now that the truth was out. She tried to speak to me when they brought her forward, but the judge cut her off and reminded her that all communication had to happen through counsel. She lowered her head and folded her hands, the same way she used to do when she wanted me to believe she was fragile. I did not say a word to her. There was nothing left for either of us to say. Raymond looked older than he had in years, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled on his shoulders. He did not try to defend himself. He did not look at me. When the judge read the charges against him, he barely reacted. I wondered if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Some quiet part of him tired of carrying a lie too big for his conscience. The prosecutors laid out the timeline with chilling clarity. The move from Kansas, the forged documents, the online searches, the accounts tied to Linda's old addresses. I watched it all like someone watching a documentary about a stranger's life. Sometimes I forgot they were talking about me. When the hearing ended, I stepped into the hallway and breathed for what felt like the first time in hours. Detective Hill approached me and said the trial likely would not be long. She said I had handled myself well. I did not feel brave, but I thanked her. She told me that my statement had been one of the most grounded she had heard in her career. I was not sure what to do with that. Back in Colorado, Jenna insisted on cooking dinner even on the nights she was too tired, telling me that feeding her family was something she had missed for too many years, to let anyone else take it from her again. Michael spent long hours in the shop and then came home ready to help me with paperwork, documents, steps for restoring my legal identity as Mason Warren. Every form felt like a small reclaiming of something I had lost. One afternoon, while I sat at the kitchen table filling out a name restoration form, my phone buzzed with a message from Harper. She wrote that the detectives had asked her for a follow-up statement, and she had given them everything she knew. She said she hoped the truth would be the start of something better for me. I texted her a thank you and meant it more than she knew. Another day, a letter arrived in the mail. The return address was the correctional facility in Nebraska. I knew without opening it who had sent it. I stared at it for a long moment before setting it in a drawer. I did not need to read whatever she had written. I already carried enough of her words in my head. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. The courtroom was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when everyone already knows the outcome. Linda kept her eyes on the table while the judge read the sentence. 20 years without parole. She did not look back when they escorted her away. Raymond received 5 years. He nodded once at me as he passed, almost like a goodbye. I did not return the gesture. After the verdict, I stepped outside and felt the sharp Colorado sun hit me. Michael walked beside me, his hand brushing my shoulder in a steadying way. Jenna waited near the car, wiping her eyes even though she tried to hide it. Caleb stood behind them with his hands in his pockets, watching me carefully, as if checking to see how much of this I could carry. I told them I was all right. It was the first time that sentence felt almost true. In the weeks that followed, I started helping at Michael's shop more regularly. I learned how to rebuild carburetors and change out brake systems. It felt good to work with my hands again, this time for reasons that belonged to me. The customers were friendly and the work was steady. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something instead of patching holes. Jenna introduced me to a few neighbors who remembered the case from the old missing posters. Some hugged me like they had known me all my life. Some just shook my hand and said they were glad I found my way back. Every interaction chipped away at the wall I had kept around myself. Caleb asked me to join him on weekend hikes, and I said yes more often than I expected. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just walked. The silence between us shifted from awkward to comfortable. One morning, he handed me a small box. Inside was an old pocket knife with our grandfather's initials scratched into the handle. He said it had been meant for me. He said he had kept it all these years, but it was time I had it. I closed the box slowly and felt something settle deep in my chest. Something like acceptance. As spring warmed and the snow melted out of the yards, Jenna encouraged me to come with them to a community event hosted by the Missing Children Network. I almost said no, worried it would stir up too much. But she insisted, and Caleb nodded. And Michael said they would stand with me the whole time. So I agreed. The event was held in a small auditorium in downtown Fort Collins. Parents, volunteers, law enforcement, and families gathered in rows. Some faces carried grief, some carried hope, some carried both. When the coordinator asked if I would share a few words, I felt the familiar tightening in my throat. But I said yes and walked to the front. I stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice steadied after the first sentence. I told them what had happened to me in the simplest way I could. I told them that I had lived most of my life believing in a story that was never mine. I told them that rebuilding a life takes time, and healing does not follow a straight line. But finding the truth is always worth it. I said that hope matters, even when it hurts to hold on to. I said that searching matters, even when the trail is cold. I said that every child deserves a chance to come home. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long second. Then people began to stand. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, human, honest. Michael had a hand on my shoulder. Jenna was crying again. Caleb nodded once with a look that said more than words could. Later that evening, back home, I stepped out onto the porch and watched the sun dip behind the mountains. The swing creaked softly in the breeze, the same sound I had heard the first day I arrived. Except now it did not feel like a stranger's house. It felt like a place where a man could start over. I thought about the years I lost, the lies I lived, the people who waited for me, the ones who hurt me, the ones who helped me find my way back. Then I thought about the people out there still waiting for answers, still searching, still hoping someone might come home. If you stayed with me through my story, I hope you will stay a little longer. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. Tell me where you are listening from. Stories like mine matter because they remind us that truth can survive even the darkest places, and that sometimes the smallest act of speaking up can change someone's life. If my journey reached you in any way, I would be grateful if you subscribed so these stories can keep finding the people who need them most.